Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today we're going to talk about the building behind me, the Reptile House. Have to start by saying thank you to a gentleman named Ethan who suggested we do some stories on the zoo. Great idea. We'll start with the Reptile House. And to a woman named Sarah Evans who did wonderful research and a great piece on this building for our explore.baltimoreHeritage.org website and app. We'll put a link to that. So thank you to you both. All right, when I moved to Baltimore many years ago, I was driving around Druid Hill Park and I came upon this building and it really struck me. And it struck me not because of its great architecture. I mean, it's nice, but it's not great. Or its huge size. It's an okay sized building, but it's not looming. What struck me was that it's kind of out here all by itself. There are no other buildings around it. It's not part of a cluster of anything. There's some ball fields nearby, but clearly this building was not built to be part of ball fields. What was it? When I learned that it was part of the zoo, that it was the old Reptile House, the mystery grew even more for me because we're not really near the zoo. We're almost half a mile from the zoo's entrance, I measured. I know some of you are chuckling and saying to yourselves, Johns, of course, it's the Reptile House. I've been there many times. And that's probably true. It operated as the Reptile House from 1948 until 2004 when it closed. But it did not begin its life as the Reptile House. It began its life as a pumping station. The high service reservoir pumping station, Many of us know the main reservoir in Druid Hill Park, Druid Lake, that supplies drinking water and is now being put into big, caverns underground, and hopefully we'll still have a lake at the end of it. But in its heyday, Druid Hill Park had 3 reservoirs, at least 3, and this was one of them. This reservoir was created in 1866. The park started in 1860. And when the park got going, it took the Rogers estate and turned it into a park. And the city turned the Rogers mansion into a place for visitors. And one of the things it did is put fountains on either side of the mansions. And this reservoir, the high service reservoir, was the water source for those fountains. It got its water from a reservoir in Hamden. If you know where the Hamden skate park is, it was basically there, 33rd and Falls Road. This pumping station behind me was built in 1921. It was actually the 3rd pumping station for that little reservoir. It didn't last long as a pumping station. By 1928, the city had taken the reservoir out of service. It was part of the drinking water supply system then, but no longer needed. And the building went vacant. But in 1938, so about 10 years later, the city had a great idea. And that was to turn this pumping station with its little pond of water near it into an aquarium. That's right, this is the city's first aquarium, long before the splashy big new one at the Inner Harbor. And in fact, there are some indications that we had an aquarium even before that. In 1882, the City Parks Board was meeting, and the notes from there indicate that they had turned the first pumping station for this reservoir, a stone building that still exists, but was no longer needed. In 1882, they turned that into an experimental aquarium. They hired a gentleman from Hopkins, the newly formed university, named, let me get his name right, his name was Otto Lugger. They hired Professor Lugger to start a saltwater aquarium in the building. He collected fish from the Chesapeake and the Atlantic seaboard down to the Carolinas. But that was an experimental one. It was paid for, incidentally, by none other than John Work Garrett, the president of the B&O Railroad and a park lover for sure. But here in 1938, we converted this former pump station into our first permanent aquarium. The architect was a gentleman named Frederick Thomas, who went on to become the chief architect for the park system. And the work was done by workers from the Work Projects Administration, the WPA, during the Depression. So pretty neat there. But it lasted as an aquarium only about 10 years. And in 1948, we have Mayor Thomas D'Alessandro ushering in the new era for the building as the Reptile House. And it was a grand reptile house. It had a pool in the middle of it with little alligators and turtles swimming around. And it it had glass tanks, aquariums built into the walls around the outside, holding all sorts of reptiles and amphibians. The city had hired artists to paint behind the walls, or paint the walls behind the tanks, various woodland scenes or swamp scenes, so that when you looked at the creatures, they looked like they were in their natural environments. However, if you looked up in 1948 at that opening, you would see remnants from the aquarium days in the form of dolphins and ocean scenes on the ceiling above. So that remained for a number of years. So the question is, how did we get so many creatures, so many reptiles in on our opening day in 1948? And we had over 250 reptiles there right from the beginning. And the answer is really two gentlemen. And the first gentleman was named Arthur Watkins, and he was the newly appointed director of the zoo. And he was a good pick for that because he was a lifelong snake fan. That's good to open up a reptile house. And he was kind of a showman. Let me read you what he wrote leading up to the opening in 1948. He wrote, "When we open, we will have one of the best collections of snakes in this country. We'll be short only a cobra, a mambo, and a python." So he had grand expectations for sure. The second gentleman responsible for all those reptiles was a gentleman named John Cooper. He was 18 years old, and he was the chief curator for this new reptile house. And Watkins turns to Cooper and says, "Cooper, I want you to go down to Georgia and collect as many snakes as you can." And Cooper goes down to the Ogeechee River area in Georgia, and apparently is a really good snake hunter because he comes back with tons and tons of snakes for the new reptile house. Cooper, incidentally, is a better snake hunter than he is curator. At least he likes it more, because he leaves Baltimore pretty shortly after that and goes on to an unbelievable career as an explorer and a naturalist. He publishes over 130 scholarly articles on various scientific things. He pioneers techniques in cave diving and is one of the leading experts for a number of species of crayfish that live in caves. So got a great start all from collecting snakes for the new reptile house. The reptile house flourishes under Watkins and then really flourishes under Watkins' successor as the director of the zoo, Frank Groves. And Groves is a nationally known herpetologist. And from this humble building, former pump house, he pioneers techniques in education, scientific education, as well as captive breeding. And I believe some of those captive breeding techniques for reptiles are still used today. The building does not stay the reptile house forever. The zoo closes it in 2004 when it goes through some fiscal crises. And it's been vacant pretty much ever since. However, right, we're not going to end on a down note. We're going to end on an up note. In 2019, right before the pandemic, the city announced plans to restore it and open it back up as a meeting space and office space for the city's recreation sports leagues. So we're going to end on a note of optimism that when the pandemic ends, we will see this building restored, not for scientists studying breeding techniques of frogs and turtles, but rather for umpires and referees and sports league folks plotting out the spring schedule for ultimate frisbee and softball. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.